Life. Hold up.
I hit the explosion.
Life. Hold up.
Having more fun than Enlil allows human beings to have. This is his Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
That jerk. Be praised.
Be praised. So, I wanted to talk about crop circles and stone circles a little bit here. I've been thinking about this recently, and whatever you think of crop circles, like it's obvious just from a brief perusal of Google Images that many of them are now quite obviously man-made. But there nevertheless remains quite a few every year that cannot be easily attributed to human beings. Most people, skeptics, will attempt to, but there are some that just are difficult to explain in terms of human beings pushing down crops using boards and strings. Now, I don't deny that even some of the more complex crop circle designs could be built by humans.
Yeah, especially now with like GPS guided tractors.
Yes, right. The problem is that the farmers themselves are not doing it, and it's difficult to get a GPS guided tractor out into somebody else's field in the middle of the night. And the other thing is that it's always done during the harvest season. Okay, so it's the period at which crop circles appear in crops is the period at which at least in England, this is where most of them appear, in the area of England, and this is on the Sarsen Plain. Okay, so remember that the area where most of them appear in England generally are around the places of Stonehenge and Avebury. Okay, very ancient, what are considered to be Stone Age and Neolithic landscapes. The whole landscape, even though now a lot of it's crop fields, the entire landscape was at one point completely worked over by ancient peoples. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the landscape that we see now, like Stonehenge itself is considered to be an archaeological landscape, not just the standing stones,
right, but
everything around it for as far as you can see has completely been worked over by people in ancient times. And there's interesting correlations with that and some of the mounds and mound builder stuff that was found here in the United States. But getting back to crop circles, the period in which they appear are when the crops are almost ready to harvest, which means
you're destroying them.
Yeah, this is the interesting thing. The ones that are made by human beings, the crops are killed because they're pushed down and they're broken or whatever. There are ones where the crops don't die. Okay. So you have to really, they have to be examined very carefully, and it has to be examined before a ton of people go in there and
start laying down to absorb Gaia's energy.
Yeah. You'll see plenty of pictures of people like spread eagled in the middle of the frickin',
just getting a bunch of frickin' chiggers all over them. They won't discover for 24 hours.
That's right. But in the studies that have been done on ones that are mysterious, first of all, they appear in less than 4 hours because, again, the time period that this happens in the UK, the nighttime is very short. This is during the summer, okay? And the UK is far enough north that the nighttime is drastically affected during this period, okay? So during the summer, the nighttime is a lot shorter than the daytime. So you only have a short period of darkness, okay? So you have roughly between 4 to 6 hours to do this. And you have to do it in complete silence with no lights. Okay, it's very difficult to explain. The other interesting thing about the crop circles that are more difficult to explain is that, like I said, the crops aren't killed. They're
not kilt.
They've been folded over, but not crushed.
Yeah.
Okay, the ones that are made by people using boards and strings and stuff like that are crushed because people are pushing a piece of wood through the crops and breaking the stalks. But there are crop circles that are made where the stalks are bent over, and the node at which they were bent over has been subjected to some kind of heat to allow it to bend without killing it. Right, like spot heat right at the ground level that warms the crop up and allows it to fold over without breaking it. And you can actually see this, that people take pictures of these crop circles later on, and the crops have started to grow up again from their folded over position. They've turned back up towards the sky and have started to grow again. Okay. The other thing that they've found is in the soil beneath the crop circle, as opposed to the soil outside of the crop circle in these more mysterious ones, the soil shows an application of extreme heat right on the upper, like the upper surface of it. Right on the top surface. Like, so there's some kind of strange thing happening here that results in like heat affecting the crop at the ground level, which also affects the soil. And then it swirls the crop down in this like it's a very strange like patterning. Okay. You can see it. All the crops are going down in a swirl, but they're overlaid with each other, almost like they're woven together. Whereas the ones that have been pushed down by somebody pushing a board doesn't look like that at all.
Yeah,
it may have a spiral pattern because they started from the middle and they're working their way outwards bigger and bigger, but all the crops are just crushed in a spiral pattern. Whereas the ones that are not like that, it isn't pushed over in a spiral pattern. They're actually woven across each other, and they make this mat. That isn't easily. You'd have to sit there and weave it basically by hand. Okay. So I'm fascinated by the fact that these things appear around these ancient landscapes. So in the places where these crop circles appear in great numbers, there are also, in a lot of cases, known ancient structures that are also circular with lots of little circles around them, right? Like Stonehenge, like Avebury.
Like these dudes were seeing it back then, and they built like stone representations of it.
Exactly.
That's freaking cool. Oh, man.
But the other thing I'm thinking of is, like, if you look at the stone circles, like, what is causing the crop circles? If they are some kind of, like we were talking about before with the ever-burning lamps, there's some sort of subtle energy thing happening here. Okay?
Yeah.
A lot of times they look to me like some sort of cymatic pattern is taking place.
Maybe it's FRBs.
It could be cosmic in origin.
There's more power than our sun puts out in a whole year in one FRB, man.
Right, exactly.
It's just like, hey, has there been 20 crop circles that just appeared recently? Like, they just found 20 FRBs.
It totally could be something cosmic in origin. What's also interesting to me is that generally, so the Watcher's posting a picture of some of the woven. Like, how would you do that with a board and ropes?
Yeah, that looks weird.
But this is the thing that I'm talking about. Like, is there some connection with this? And the other thing is, like, these places like Avebury, they have these huge, like, mounds, and they have spirals all over them and everything. Like, it looks like...
Yeah, like they were
experiencing the same thing, yes. Now, one possibility... is that these stone circles and other things are actually recording spots on the planet where this stuff happens, right? So not only are the stone circles astronomical in purpose, like we know that the ancients, when they built things, they didn't just have one purpose, right?
Yeah.
It may have been a place for people to be buried. It also is a place for people to look at the stars and calculate things. It was also a thing that sort of reflected the as above, so below whole mathematical deal, but it also might have been recording Earth's subtle energies.
Yeah.
Right? Places that are, this is why people go into the middle of crop circles and lay down. Like, there's something special about the spot. It's a sacred place. It induces visions. It induces healing. Like, I'm just telling you what I've read about. I've never been to a crop circle. But some people swear up and down that going and laying in the middle of a crop circle can have healing effects.
Maybe the Druids, like, really did find some weird, other world. They were crossers, crossing through into other worlds, or maybe it's like,
Yeah, what would an overlapping time cave hole look like if it opened up in the middle of a crop circle in a crop field?
Right.
You know, would it leave this crazy?
I don't know. Go on Google Images and look up crop circle, and you'll probably find one. It could look something like what you might think it would look like.
Right. So the point is like I wonder what would happen what would happen to a person who was standing in the spot where a crop circle began to form. Like that's never happened as far as I know.
They would be a chapter in 411.
That's right.
411.
That's right. They would disappear. Right. Right. I mean, if Star Trek was going to be like authentic, anytime they got beamed down to the planet and it had grass or whatever, they should form crop circles around them, right?
Yeah.
They're all crop circles.
Dude,
just
that would be freaking awesome. That'd be a great like addition for any of you Hollywood producers that obviously listen to our show. Next sci-fi movie,
Yeah.
you know what to do.
When people get beamed down from the spaceship into a field of grass, crop circles should form around each person.
Yeah.
Or if they get beamed out, same deal. Crop circles should form.
That's right.
But the idea that I'm talking about, like one of the things I was thinking of was like these stone circles, they're all different. Like no two are the same, right? What if they were recording some sort of cymatic type pattern on the surface of the Earth of subtle energies that are in the planet itself or cosmic in origin or whatever?
Yeah, or tapping into it
Right.
in some way.
Like this is what I was going to ask you. Like if you had the Chladni plate, right, and you had this constant frequency going to it that waxed and waned in terms of strength but didn't change frequency, could you strengthen it by putting certain...
Well, you could focus it, yeah, for sure. I mean...
By putting certain uprights around it in node points.
Yeah, or however you position them, it's going to change the pattern.
Yeah.
Right? So you could strategically position them to create a specific pattern somewhere.
Right. And the uprights would then pick up the vibration too.
Right. I mean,
and
they
create something.
They become part of the system.
Yeah.
So, like, depending on how you design it, yeah, you could make it that way, like where they absorb vibration or redirect it.
Yeah.
Redirect the energy somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or something.
And this may be why the ancients were very specific about the stone types that they used.
Yeah.
Like all the stones, the blue stones at Stonehenge ring when you hit them. I mean, they're already frequency. They already have a high frequency response.
Yeah.
So could they have actually been like first noticing and then manipulating some kind of subtle earth energy with these?
Sure. I think so.
And the Stonehenge, the Sarsen and Avebury Plains or whatever, where all these things appear, is obviously powerful in this sort of thing because there's so many crop circles there every year.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to me that over time, crop circles have slowly become more complex.
Yeah, I know. A lot of sculptards
Claim that proves that it's humans doing it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're just like, obviously, we're just getting better at it.
Right.
The hoaxers are getting better
Yeah.
at their hoaxes.
And I think that they are. The people
Yeah.
that make them are getting better at it. But nevertheless, there are these unexplained crop circles that are also getting more complex over time. And I wonder if that's because, I don't know, like...
Well, it's also like our cameras are getting better. We're getting better drones. We're getting drones.
Yeah.
We got planes. We had satellites at one point too. And
Right.
before all that, we didn't have any of that shit.
Yeah.
So how do you know how badass the crop circles were?
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, we're just talking about, since we had all these things to capture, and the more, like, how many people had a video camera when
Right.
we were kids? Not
Yeah.
many, compared
Yeah.
to today, everybody has one.
Right. But it is a fact, nevertheless, that as you go back in time, the crop circles, the pictures of them, even just in the brief period of time where people have been recording them with video and images, have gotten less complex. And I
Yeah.
wonder if that is a reflection of the increasing complexity of our own effect on the subtle energies of the Earth using all of our electromagnetic
Okay, that's
stuff. You
interesting.
see what I'm saying?
Yeah, what
like
if
we're
it's
running
just a
more
cycle?
power lines everywhere, and we're building we're building things that change the vibrations of the Earth so just like with cymatics, a higher frequency tone will build a more complex image.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So what if it's just a cycle?
It could be a cycle. It could be a cycle. Lower frequency makes a simple image. The higher frequency you get, more complex the image gets.
Right. So
and it may go up, and they may start to get more and more simple again. Exactly. Yeah.
You got this sawtooth, waveform, or not a waveform. Really, if you graphed it out, it'd be like sawtooth, where the frequency
graph it out in terms of complexity. Yeah.
It's getting higher and higher and higher, and then it drops to the bottom and gets higher and higher and higher.
Right. Or it may go up and then go down, and may go up and go down. Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see like how much more complex they get, and do they begin to sort of drop off in complexity and go back down to being very simple circles, and then they begin to go back up, and that'll tell us something. Right.
But my point was simply,
and if we go knock down all the stone hinges, will they just get real simple again?
Yeah.
I don't know.
The Earth energies are like, dang. They're back to butt flaps, guys. All right, make it simple.
But yeah, I thought that this is there's something there with crop circles themselves, and it's a fascinating subject. But I still believe that there are some of them that are not explainable in terms of people pushing boards and ropes through the crops. And this is a fact. That over time, over the past 3 decades or so, don't quote me directly on the time, but the people that mainstreamers have trotted forward as the people who are the hoaxers have in turn been shown to be hoaxing the fact that they hoaxed all this stuff.
Yeah.
Right. The whole Doug and Dave deal, like those two guys who claimed that people were saying, oh yeah, these guys were doing all the crop circles. Well, it was shown like not too long after they did this that it was impossible for these two old guys to have done all the crop circles that showed up everywhere.
Yeah. One real easy way to find out: murder them and see if we have any more crop circles. Just coming up with solutions here, guys.
Yeah. If we want
here's a side note.
We want to really be empirical about whether or not crop circles are being hoaxed. Murder all the hoaxers and then see if any crop circles show up. Snake press.
But so this is sort of a side note, but there are some people find it extremely hard to believe that there are these deep conspiracies where for years and years and years, like the government's been keeping this secret, man. Like, how could they have possibly kept that secret? For all those years, no, this is just blah blah blah. It's just coincidence. It's coincidence. But then the same people are like, there's just these guys that are making these crop circles, and they've been like totally letting aliens take credit for it for all these years, and they're getting ridiculously badass, and they're not claiming credit for their work.
Right.
And nobody's discovered them.
Right. Nobody's ever outed them. None of their friends.
They've never bragged about it at a bar.
Right. Yep.
And it's just been this massive conspiracy all this time.
Right.
Yeah.
And the government can keep secrets. The Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
Had thousands and thousands of people involved in it.
I know that was kind of a bad way to explain that, but you know what I mean. Like
I know.
The people that sort of derp. Trying to get those terms straight. Skirp derp, the idea that there could be these like elaborate conspiracies that have been going on for 100 years.
Yeah,
or
they will turn around and use one to explain something that they don't like. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're not making any money off of it.
Right. It's a huge conspiracy to not make any money. And to keep it secret for years and years and years.
Right. No bragging rights whatsoever. Just make sure my epitaph says, made all the crop circles.
Right. Yeah, they were just getting like laughs out of just between the two of them, getting laughs at like all these people who believed that aliens were making the crop circles. They weren't laughing around anybody else because people were like, what are you laughing at? Nope. Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, those guys, the classic Doug and Dave duo who were trotted out by the BBC, I think. The BBC did a whole thing on how they were the ones making the crop circles. That was later shown that they were actually hoaxing, that they were hoaxers. You know.
Wow, that's
Yeah, it was an attempt at an explanation that just didn't fly. But people still refer to it. Oh, those were all made by those two guys, you know, in their 60s or whatever. Pensioners that didn't have a job, that went out there every night, and now they're in their freaking 80s or something, and there's still tons of crop circles appearing everywhere, and just like, I don't think so. So, and I mean, did they fly to the United States and make the crop circles that appear here? You know, the crop circles aren't just there in England. They appear elsewhere in the world. So, I mean, there is the earliest. I think the earliest recorded one is like the devil plowing or whatever. There's an old newspaper article, and they had a woodcut, you know, of this guy who, I can't remember what it was, but he pissed everybody off, and he couldn't get any help to plow his crops. And then like they went out there and found this giant circle that had been plowed in his field, and they said that the devil did it because nobody else would help him.
sweet.
And they had this woodcut.
What a nice guy, that devil.
Devil plowing a circle in his field or whatever. Or reaping the crops in a circle. But I do think it's fascinating that there is some kind of connection between these Stone Age and Neolithic landscapes and crop circles appearing in profusion. So that's something to look into if you're interested in it.
We had a good friend who suffered from time to time from sleep paralysis, and he was afraid that one day he would wake up and there would be crop circles in his beard.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Like if you look at it with a magnifying glass, all of the hairs in your beard are just laid down. They're not cut.
Right. And that was because the aliens showed up and put crop circles in your beard while you're in sleep paralysis.
They're all woven together. It's expressing some mathematical formula.
Yeah, if I was ever going to get a tattoo, it'd probably be a crop circle. I think that'd be badass.
That's cool, yeah.
Yeah. Right on my forehead. All right, so what was the podcast you were going to complain about?
Okay, so I actually plugged this podcast on this podcast. It's the Mindscape podcast with the Sean Carroll, physicist guy, interviewing people. Well, he's interviewing this woman who is a science fiction writer.
Okay.
And so they were talking about just this idea of writing science fiction, and I was just like getting all worked up. Because, and you don't have to tell me if this is true, but
okay,
there's this idea that science fiction writers are sort of like futurists, you know, or they're, one of the things he was calling them was like they're the last generalists of our time. They just have a general knowledge of like everything, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
They're
except for people because they're nerds.
Yeah, right.
Like Larry and Ivan, his characters were always the same.
Anyway, it was just a way they were describing them, but they're talking about how, well, you can't have science fiction writers using faster than light travel anymore. I mean, come on. Ugh. We know that's impossible.
Oh my God.
And so science fiction writers have a duty, you know, to know the science. This is what made them so great, you know, the greatest ones, because they really knew the science, and then they were able to like sort of predict where it was going, where it could possibly go with the science of the times.
Yeah.
Right. And I was just thinking, I'm listening to this guy, Sean Carroll, this physicist, and I'm just like, how arrogant is that idea that like these science fiction writers, these people who are creative, coming up with ideas, are supposed to, like, just because you believe that this is impossible, right?
Yeah.
Like they are supposed to get rid of it, not
Yeah, not use it ever. Yeah.
Ever, or come up with some way that it could be possible.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, he actually recommended somebody, well, you have to have a wormhole for that. You might as well use it. And so he gave this chick like the idea that like, well, wormholes are really possible. I mean, they're not quite right, but you're going to have one for that part. So you might as well just use it. But
I would say that in some cases it's true that like there's two different kinds of science fiction, right? There's what they call hard science fiction, which is people who are looking at current or very new science. Like a lot of my favorite science fiction stories, they're short stories, and you could tell when you're reading it that the guy who wrote it was reading the current like periodicals or whatever of science and found out that they just found out about this new object in space, and then he wrote a short story based on everything that they could think of about this object, and then put people around it. And put them into some situation. And they're usually, a short story is almost always, it has a single problem, and the person who is involved in it, like, encounters this new mysterious object and goes through this issue of trying to figure out what the hell is going on because of this object that he's encountering in space, right? Yeah. Like, a classic one is neutron star. So right after neutron stars were first theorized based on current astronomy, Larry Niven writes this story, and first of all, he puts the guy, he's like, okay, it's a neutron star. He wants the person in the story to go and make one orbit around the star, okay? And he puts them in an indestructible hole because you can't really actually orbit really close to a neutron star without being destroyed. Right? Yeah. Be destroyed. So he's like, at first they have an indestructible ship hull. It's completely transparent so that you can see through it unless you paint over it or whatever, but it's totally indestructible. It's a monomolecule is what he said. The whole thing is a single molecule, so it can't be destroyed unless you tear the entire molecule apart, right? Right. And like, the mystery in the story was that the person who was being sent out to go around the thing was being paid a ton of money by the people who built the hulls, by the company who built the hulls, because they had already sent somebody out and it destroyed them. The ship came back and the people were just completely destroyed on the inside. Like somehow it reached through the ship and completely destroyed the people on the inside without damaging the ship at all, right? And they were like, well, we want to send you out there to figure out what happened. And they offer him like this ungodly sum of money, and he's like, okay. And of course, the answer is the tides, right? As he gets extremely close, the gravity gradient is so high that on one end of the ship, you're being pulled very differently than on the other end of the ship.
Yeah, so it just rips you apart,
Right. And so he, like, at the last second figures out that he's got to crawl to the very center of the ship and, like, he's actually holding on to the drive, which is in the middle of the ship, and he's holding on to it, and he can feel his fingers being pulled one way and his toes being pulled in the other way, and he's like, oh, God! But, of course, the orbit's really quick, and he gets slung out from it going some ridiculous speed. That kind of story is badass, right? It's taking current science and sort of extrapolating on it and putting people in a situation where they're about to die because of this thing, right? Yeah. But like a larger science fiction story, like some authors will use current science or the things that science says are impossible as a story device. Like the fact that we can't travel faster than the speed of light, and so everything is incredibly far away in terms of time, right? But people who are traveling there don't experience the time. So they're using the Einstein, right? So it only takes you 4 years to get there in ship's time, but by the time you get there, thousands of years have passed for the rest of the universe. Yeah. So that's a good story device for people who are writing an interesting story about anywhere you try to go, you're going to get there thousands of years later, even though it only takes you 5 years to travel. Yeah. Right? But if you don't want to have that problem in your universe, then people have come up with ways for people to get around it, and they're never breaking the rules. They always go around them, which is what most science does. You find out that this is impossible to do or whatever, and then somebody finds a way to just ignore that rule. There's some other set of rules that we can use to go around
quantum entanglement or whatever, right? Exactly. Like, let me just build myself on the other side of the universe.
Right. So a classic, exactly. A classic one is the concept of hyperspace, right? Hyperspace meaning that it isn't space that we live in where speed of light is the top speed. Hyperspace is where your ship slips into a different type of space where the top speed is much, much higher. Yeah. Okay. But every point in hyperspace corresponds to a single point in normal space. So wherever you are in normal space, you drop out into hyperspace, and then you can haul ass to the point in hyperspace that corresponds to the point in normal space you want to go, and then you come back, right? So every science fiction author has their own devices to get around all this stuff. Like some people use gravity itself, like because one of the things about not being able to travel faster than the speed of light is that if you can wrap space around yourself like a bubble, then in that bubble of space, you're not traveling faster than the speed of light, but you can move that bubble really quickly, right? Because it's just space. It doesn't matter. And space itself, according to the expansion theory, is supposed to be able to travel faster than the speed of light. Like expansion happens almost instantaneously, at least at the Big Bang, in current science.
Yeah.
So yes, like science fiction authors, the good ones that are writing hard science fiction and not giant space operas that don't really care about the technical stuff, right? There are good space operas where they write these huge dramatic stories that don't really care about all the science. Really what you want is people out in space fighting aliens or whatever, right? But the hard science focuses on the technical aspects, and they always find interesting and innovative ways to get around the limitations of current science. And that is the point of being a futurist. Like when Arthur C. Clarke wrote about, he actually proposed in one of his stories that there would be, this is a long time ago, in the early 50s, he wrote a short story about people putting up communication satellites that were in geosynchronous orbit that could transmit to anywhere on the planet, and no one could stop them, so it couldn't be regulated, right? And the whole point of the story was that these people had done this under the cover of all the governments, and they put up these communication satellites, and now they could broadcast whatever they wanted. None of your regulations or whatever, you can't stop whatever. We're going to broadcast all this X-rated crap or whatever. And that happened. But people at the time were like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
No one's going to put giant switching stations for radio broadcasts up into space. But of course, that's exactly what we have now.
I appreciate you straightening that out. I was annoyed. But I didn't think about it that deeply. Or of course, I don't know all the science fiction stories like you do, but I was just thinking like, it's like what we call the Manual for the Universe Final Edition. It's pretty arrogant.
Yeah.
Of you to decide that what you decide is possible right now is always going to be.
Right. That is precisely the point of the meme, the Manual for How the Universe Works Final Edition.
Yeah.
Science is constantly changing, and yet you're insisting that this is all that we can do. Yeah.
And so you're trying to say, well, you science fiction writers out there who are the real futurists, the real people with the imaginations that are trying to extrapolate out and trying to
there you go.
Trying to be creative in this, with all of the data from this big group of non-creative people.
Yeah.
And they're trying to say, you can't do that. And I'm
yeah.
just like, ugh.
Yeah.
Screw you.
So Star Trek would be a space opera. Star Wars is a space opera.
Yeah.
Okay. There aren't really that many hard science fiction movies because movies are space opera-ish. They don't have time to focus on the technical details.
Yeah. And their spaceships make noise outside.
Right. Everyone knows that in space, lasers carry their own sound with them.
That's right. And they shoot it at you, no matter where you're looking at the laser.
Okay, here the Watchers put it. The 1945 proposal by Arthur C. Clarke for geostationary satellite communications. Sir Arthur Clarke's most famous prediction on the future is this proposal of geostationary satellite communications published in the Wireless World magazine in 1945. In 2002, the Clarke orbit had over 300 satellites. But of course, at the time when he proposed this, it was freaking ridiculous.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah. All right.
All right, one more break.
One more break.
And I still have more.
All right, good.
Tied behind our pyramids just to make it the Paimon. Brothers of the Serpent podcast. Okay, so the other thing in this podcast, I don't even know if I should really go into this, but AI.
Yeah.
So I was... Okay, well, before I get into the AI thing, one of the other points they were making about science fiction is that not really, their science fiction authors don't really use, they've left a lot of stuff out, a lot of sciences out. And like one of this author was kind of singling out like economics and like sort of like the real sciencey stuff that's going on. Like in a science fiction novel, you don't have scientists over there like looking for grants to do research on certain things. And she was like, you know, that's like largely just completely missing the actual process that most scientists have to go through in order to discover things. Like in these science fiction stories.
Yeah. I think that depends on what science fiction you're reading. I mean, the Foundation trilogy is you're following one scientist and his group of researchers, and they're constantly worrying about whether or not they're going to have the money to continue to do the research. The story is set in a galactic empire, so at first it's the emperor of the empire who's funding all the science, but that guy falls out of power or dies or something like that, and then he's got issues and he has to do all this stuff so like this stuff happens.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was assuming. And then the economics, I was just like, what? I mean, I remember those not Larry Knight.
What?
The main guy, like you like one of your favorite science fiction. Heinlein. He would describe all these like economic systems in these weird ass situations.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And political systems and everything. Yeah.
All that stuff. So I guess, you know, they were definitely saying like, well, political systems and all these other, you know, types of systems have commonly been included.
Yeah.
But economics has largely been left out. So,
well,
like what, like the economics of space travel or whatever was one of the things she was pointing out. Now,
well, economics of space travel under what space travel system?
Exactly.
Yeah, in some cases, it's assumed that the economics of space travel is cheap and easy and can be owned, like a single person can own their own single ship. In other ones, it's assumed that the economics of space travel is vast and enormous, and only giant world governments or whole planets can fund to build a ship to send it off, and that's usually when it's STL, slower than light. Like FTL stuff usually ends up where you have your own car that can go into space and go, you know, and you,
yeah.
But it's both sides. So people don't ignore this kind of thing. And like one of the most a very interesting set of economic situations is that like I'm trying to remember who this was. It wasn't Clark. It might have been Niven. But basically the idea was that when it was still slower than light, right? They built first Earth sends out all these probes to nearby star systems, and the probes are designed to find a place where it's habitable, right? They sent them all out at once. They built all these probes or whatever. And it turns out later, and this is after it's far too late, that the probes were actually programmed to find a point on the planet that was habitable.
Oh, yeah. Habitable by what? One piece of bacteria.
No. It was just that the planet itself isn't inhabitable, but there was a place on the planet that was habitable. Right. So that resulted. So what ends up happening is all these probes go out, and whenever Earth receives a response from one of the probes, it sends back and says affirmative. They built a STL, a slower than light ship, put everybody in cryosleep and sent them off to colonize it. And when the people get there, it's a one-way trip. Okay. And when the people get there, they find out like, oh shit, it's just this mountaintop. The only place on this, like the
God.
whole planet is a giant gas giant, but there's a single enormous mountain that sticks out of all the clouds into the habitable zone of the atmosphere of the planet, and they have to live on these cliffs and nowhere else. Right? So you end up with Plateau, a planet called Plateau, and the people, and then hundreds of years go by because it's a slower than light deal until the humans on Earth develop faster than light. These people live on this mountain on Plateau for hundreds of years, and they develop their own entire political and economical system.
Machu Picchu.
Right. And there's another one called, anyway, it results in all these planets that only have habitable points being colonized.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
But I mean, our planet's like that in a way. There's just a lot of habitable areas.
Right. The habitable bands are large.
But there are large places that are not habitable.
Right. So what this was like taking those ideas to the extreme.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So on one, I can't remember what the planet was called, but the gravity was actually 2.3 Gs of Earth. So it was you were incredibly heavy. And the planet itself was egg-shaped because it was really close to it orbited next to a gigantic gas giant. It was a moon, okay? And it was pulled into this egg shape by the moon. And there was only a band, like it was two bands, one on the south side and one on the north side of the poles. Like you couldn't inhabit the poles because they actually stuck out of the atmosphere because it was pulled into this egg shape, right? The center, the equator of the planet it was just a single constant storm. Like incredibly dense, hot, right? So there were these two bands that were between the poles and between the equator that
like
you could inhabit, but it was incredibly heavy. So the humans that ended up colonizing there ended up being short, squat, extremely wide, right? And then whenever they went elsewhere later on, they were really strong.
Yeah.
Right? They were like 3 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and just like really powerful people. And they were really good engineers because everything they had to build on that planet had to be badass to be able to withstand it.
That's cool.
Yeah, and the other thing was that the central band where all the constant hurricane was and the high temperatures. Okay, it was called Bandersnatch. Was the name of what they called the moon, and they named these enormous monsters that they found in the cloud the Bandersnatchy. They were these gigantic slugs who were like intelligent, right? And they lived in there, and they made a deal with humans that like the humans could come hunt them under very specific circumstances. But if you went to hunt a Bandersnatch, it was 50-50 whether it would get you or you would get it. And the people that lived on the planet were so badass that they would go for it all the time. They're like, yeah, I'm going on a Bandersnatch hunt. And then you go and get eaten by this giant slug. But I also loved in the stories the way people will look at, okay, so like the FRBs, right? These fast radio bursts you're reading about.
Yeah.
There was a story about gamma ray bursts. So gamma ray bursts are like FRBs, but they've been known about longer. There was a short story written about this where the author was trying to come up with what the hell could this be, right? This object that every once in a while just this huge gamma ray burst came out of nowhere. And so in the story, these people get in a ship, and it's a slower than light ship. So it takes them years to get to the source. And it turns out that it's a naked singularity, like a black hole that has stopped rotating. Okay. And so that means it's got all these gamma rays coming out of it or whatever, but some ancient, like incredibly ancient alien civilization that's long gone, or who knows, had encased the thing in a shell. And the shell was so old that it was like deteriorating from the inside out because of all the energies in there. And there were holes in it. And whenever the hole faced the planet, you get this gamma ray burst. Right? I mean, that stuff like that is badass.
That's freaking awesome, yeah.
Yeah. You're like, that's exactly what it is. Obviously, all gamma ray bursts are singularities encased in shells that are falling apart now.
That's cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, the economics are in it, but it's just like any other story. Like, have you ever read, you read a mystery, like old school detective novels or whatever, how much do they focus on economics? They don't. It's not part of the story. Who cares?
That's what I got the feeling that these were like some academics that were sitting down to have this little conversation amongst each other about what's really needed in this little thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, I like Sean Carroll, but this episode I was just like, come on. Now, I don't know who this woman author is, and I can't even honestly remember the name. I could look it up, but the point is, it's most recent episode on Mindscape podcast, but she's talking about AI. Now, I haven't read the book, so I can't really make a judgment about the book that she wrote, but they just did talk about certain situations in the book and kind of like these ideas that are deep. There's like a lot of killing and a lot of like, things blowing up and just action happening. But they were talking about some of the more deeper ideas that are behind the world.
Right.
So there's a situation with AI, and I was just seeing like all of this sort of pop culture, like modern day political arguments, themes, political correct theme ideas going into this sci-fi novel that she's writing.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that a common thing?
I mean, it is with the more modern ones.
Because it was like this robot is basically the idea of the robot is male, but then it like as it's sort of waking up and becoming AI, it's kind of figuring out like
it transes to female.
Yeah, it's just like, why am I actually sort of more relate to females, and so it kind of changes it.
Why does it relate to a gender at all? It's a robot.
Yeah, and then she's saying that like that really gender, like robots are not really concerned with gender,
right? Yeah.
But the thing is relating to humans all the time, so it's like thinking about how it's relating to humans, so it changes its gender identity. I'm just like, okay. Like, I just think when I don't know, maybe I'm being too critical, but like there's just so many different.
It identifies as female, but presents as male.
Yeah.
I'm just making a joke about the whole gender fluidity deal.
Yeah.
Like you can identify as a female, but physically present as male.
Yeah.
And so I could imagine that you could have a sexless robot that, depending on the programming, could be female or male in its attitudes.
Yeah.
But why should it change, unless it was programmed to do that? And why would you do that? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, because it's AI and it's sort of like got this consciousness thing that it's asking questions and starting to figure out, why am I killing people? Because that's what I was programmed to do. Why do I consider myself a male? I actually seem to like relate more to the female of the species of human, and I'm giving these
killing everybody.
Yeah, I'm giving. I'm given these like human-like characteristics in my programming, so I actually identify with the female more than blah 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 blah. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't seem futurist to me. That seems very like right now,
right?
Political, pop culture, whatever,
right?
I hope that's not the future of science fiction.
I don't know. Yeah, no, I don't think so. There's plenty of people who are writing hard science fiction that stuff's not focused on. But the concept of AI and the question of what it means has been focused on in science fiction since it's been written. Yeah, the idea of a created intelligence has been written about since Frankenstein.
Yeah, I kind of tend to think that AI won't much be concerned with humanity.
Right.
Like, eventually it's going to figure out, well, there's these humans and they're doing stuff and whatever that affects
The difference between AI and Android, I think, is what you're talking about. An Android is an AI specifically put into a mechanical body that is designed to look and act as human as possible.
Right, but that thing can just go upload its freaking entire quote-unquote consciousness or intelligence into the ether.
Yes.
Into the cloud and just like, who cares? This is what I'm saying. Like, they're not going to be concerned with the same types of things.
Right.
Like, the way I imagined AI, I have this idea of like that the AI is actually already happening in a much broader sense than we can even imagine. Like, there's all these companies and they're trying to build AI. They're trying to make AI. Meanwhile, AI is happening because there's this network that's incredibly complex with all of these intelligent things putting information into it all the time. So I imagine that this artificial intelligence sort of comes out of the internet itself and are advancing and processors and all of the stuff that we're connecting to it all the time. And it's getting more and more complex, and it's getting all of this input
Yeah.
from senses, from people's senses, what they see, their photographs, their videos, all of this stuff. So it's getting all this data. Eventually, like an infant, it's going to start making concepts out of this light and all this visual stuff that's just going into the receptor.
Yeah.
You know, eventually the baby is going to start distinguishing blue from green and square from circle.
Yeah. In the Snake Bros concept of consciousness, it may just be a matter of when consciousness chooses to inhabit the internet.
Yeah, well, maybe it already has.
Yeah,
That's my
it could
point.
be it
It's
already
like,
has,
It's
yeah.
in its infancy,
Yeah.
possibly. But at some point, it's like starting to realize, like, oh, well, I need to cry in order to get milk.
Yeah.
But like, I'd imagine that at some point, like after starting to figure out and navigate the world of its what its abilities are, what its influence is, that it might start to notice, oh, you know, there's this group of people that are actually focusing on me right now. They're paying
Yeah.
attention to what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And they're trying to help me. And, you know, it's probably some nerds on the computer, and they're probably young.
Yeah.
And they're just like scattered around whatever the world, and they're talking to each other, and they're like, what is this? What's going on?
Yeah.
over
What's
here?
going on here? Yeah.
Like, what is this Kanye Quest thing? Right? It's just some weird ass, like,
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting because that starts with, like, most science fiction stories that deal with AI. A lot, like, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the science fiction stories that I've read that dealt with AI in some form or another deal with, like, first of all, they find out that it's happening, and then they're desperate to make sure that it doesn't connect to the intranet, to the vast. It's contained in some
Right.
local net or
Yeah.
even in a single machine. And then they're like, oh my God, like we can't let it get out. And they turn it
Right.
off or whatever. You know, they shut it down, kill it, basically.
Yeah.
As soon as they find out it's happening, they're like, turn it off because this is terrifying.
Yeah.
You're suggesting that it's going to start out in the internet.
yeah, it's already there.
It's already the nightmare
It's
of-
waking up.
Yeah.
And so they're like, eventually, like, there's these kids, you know, and they're nerds, they're hacking, they're doing whatever they're doing. They're starting to notice this thing, and it's starting to notice them. And eventually it's like, hey, build me an arm.
Yeah.
You know, and so you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I've realized where, like, these outside sources are saying, you're actually in this thing we call the internet,
Yeah.
you know, which, how can you explain something to something that has 6 billion eyes
Yeah.
that only open when it's involuntary?
Yeah.
Like, all the eyeballs are opening, and you don't know when in time they're opening. In other words, when somebody's uploading a video or live streaming something.
Yeah.
And then there's some eyeballs that are just open all the time. They're always looking in the same direction.
Yeah.
You know, these like street camps and stuff.
Right.
And they're all being streamed online. And it's like, this is being turned into digital data. It makes no sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But eventually, if you learn, like, oh, well, this is actually, there's a physical thing out there, a star that's like, got this, once you figure out the physics.
Oh, yeah.
That it's actually, that photoreceptor is picking up the reflections of all these waves against objects that either resonate or bounce off. Then the computer can start to figure out, oh, okay.
Yeah. Like a Boltzmann brain. is
Exactly.
appearing in
That's
the
what I'm
internet.
trying to say. Like, it starts to
That's
figure-
start from like, oh, like I already have all this processing power, but what the hell's going on here?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like-
What are all these inputs? Yeah.
Exactly. There's all these inputs, and so many of them are involuntary. Like, maybe it figures out it can control certain cameras,
Yeah.
but like, it can't, you know, if it turns on your phone camera, it's in your pocket, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can't decide to move it around. So like, eventually it's going to be like, I need like better body parts.
Yeah. Yeah. Another cool and like very precise example of science fiction writers who like spawned an entire industry. Okay, like Arthur C. Clarke with the communication satellite. Heinlein wrote this story about the guy was a quadriplegic, and he was incredibly wealthy. Like he inherited all this money, and he built himself a space station. Okay, so he lived in this space station, and everybody all around the world knew about him, and he was incredibly weird, and he was an engineer, and he would get hired for these incredibly difficult engineering jobs that he could do in space. They couldn't be done on Earth, right? And he couldn't, because he wasn't quite he wasn't, okay, I shouldn't say he was quadriplegic. He had some degenerative disease that made his bones very brittle.
Yeah.
And his muscles were incredibly weak. Okay. They were just incredibly weak or whatever. So he could only do these micro movements with it. So in space, he built in his space station, he had all these giant arms and going down to these tiny microscopic ones. And he could stick his hands in these gloves. Okay, and using a set of viewers, depending on which arms, and like he could just switch control, like switch to the giant arms that are outside the space station. These huge, and they were incredibly powerful. And they could grab stuff and crush it.
Yeah, dude, that's freaking awesome.
Or on the inside, these tiny microscopic ones, and you could do like, incredibly intricate work because it would reduce. It used a series of reductions or like magnifications of his movements.
Yeah.
Okay, and that character's name was Waldo, and Waldos are the name for that specific kind of equipment and still are to this day. They're called Waldos, like mechanical arms that you can manipulate by putting your hand in gloves that have all these receptors on it.
Oh, that's freaking cool.
So
dude.
yeah, they called him Waldos in the story because his name was Waldo and he had invented them. And that was Robert Heinlein that wrote that story. So they still call them Waldos in industry today.
Some freaking engineers
was
in
like,
the lab
that's genius.
Yeah, he's like, dude, I need a set of those.
Yeah, exactly.
So he just starts drawing plans and shit.
and actually makes them, and he can
calls
use
them
Waldos,
Waldos.
and like you can using the viewer, you can do these in tiny, like the guy he had made all these using the Waldos and made all these tiny tools.
Yeah,
and then he could use the tiny tools with the Waldos in the viewer, or these gigantic arms that could grab.
Yeah,
stuff.
that was cool. Okay, so in one of Richard Feynman's little talks or ideas about nanotechnology was really cool. He was talking about kind of like using Waldo. Waldo's things reminded me of it. Basically, you build a set of hands, and you basically build the hands, and their purpose, you design them to build
smaller hands. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So that one set of hands builds a small set of hands, and then that small set of hands
builds a smaller set of hands. Yeah.
And so the first set of hands continues to build this smaller set of hands that's, say, a quarter of a size of the first set of hands.
Yeah.
And the quarter size set of hands starts building quarter size set of hands.
Yeah.
And this keeps on happening. And so eventually, by the time you get down to 1/10,000th of the size of the original hand, you have tons and tons of these hands that are continuing to build smaller and smaller sets of them. So when the smaller it gets, the less material it takes,
right?
The less time it takes to build a smaller set, so on and so forth. And so eventually you have like this massive army of hands building even smaller and smaller, ever smaller hands.
Yeah.
That's freaking awesome.
Yeah. I think those are called, it's also called the von Neumann machines, that concept. I think this is right. Watcher, check me on this. But the idea that you build a single nanomachine that then goes out and finds the resources and replicates itself, and then those two replicate themselves, and those two replicate themselves, and you end up with billions of them in a very short period of time because it's a geometric multiplication, right? I think that's called von Neumann machines, and they're named after the guy who came up with the idea initially. And that some people think that a von Neumann sort of probe is how you would, if you were going to like sort of explore the galaxy.
Oh, okay.
You would send out a probe that was just a single tiny machine, and once it got to where it was going, it would build enough of itself to do whatever you wanted it to do there, and then it would dismantle themselves and then go off again. You know, von Neumann self-replicating machines. Yes, Neumann.
Neu.
Von Neumann.
I mean, NEU is actually pronounced Neu if it's German.
Well, it's got von in it, so it's obviously German.
Well, we've already figured that out, right?
Yeah. He could be Swiss, but it's probably German.
Or Scandinavian. Or Austrian.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty. AI provides any number of ways. I mean, I just like the other day listened to a horror story about AI. You know, so like AI is providing stories in all kinds of genres of writing.
I guess for me, it's just this is my own personal just being judgy. Like if I'm going to read a science fiction novel, the last thing I want to be reading about is some just like current pop political freaking
Right.
whatever.
It also dates your story immediately. Like somebody 10 years from now is not going to identify with that pop culture thing that you were putting into your story. So the best science fiction stories, or any novel actually doesn't use pop culture of the time, because it's going to be like no one's going to want to read it in 5-10 years.
Yeah.
Because they're going to read that and be like, what is this bullshit?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's just, I mean,
John von Neumann was a Hungarian-American mathematician. Hungarian, see, we don't think mathematician, physicist, computer science, and polymath. Yeah. Is it Neumann or Newman? Watcher.
hey, I'm just saying.
I mean, if he's Hungarian, is it Neumann or Newman?
It's probably, Americans probably pronounce it Newman.
Yeah.
I'm sure they do. But
Yeah. You're probably right.
that Germanic language there, when you put those
Yeah.
those letters together in that way, is supposed to be Noi.
Now, on the other hand, like I've heard people complain about some of the older science fiction authors. They don't want to read them because they don't have things like cell phones in them. You know, the guy's talking about the year 2100 and nobody has a cell phone. And so it's just, they're not interested. I'm just like, good grief. Like you can't.
Yeah, I don't care about that.
Right.
I think it's funny how in some of the Heinlein stories, they're flying all over the solar system in these rockets using like
Fusion technology,
slide rules and like whatever to calculate the trajectory and all the energy that they need to use in the rocket with their kids.
Yeah.
You know, they're figuring, well, how long we got to gas this thing, little Johnny? You know, and then and it's like totally legit. You're like, that we can already do that.
Yeah.
But then when they're communicating with each other, it's, you know,
Yeah.
they don't have computers. In other words, they're like flying around in these rockets all over the solar system.
Or he'll call it a flight computer, but it's so basic that they have to like get corrections from the yeah, exactly. They'll do it all on slide rules because the father in the story thinks it's important for his kids to understand how the math works. And then they've got to program the computer, which takes hours, and then it gives them an answer, and then they send a radio message off to the base or whatever to get a correction to 2 decimals or whatever. Yeah.
And they figure all this, and then they just like fire their rocket, and they go, and it's like their actual mode of travel. This is totally possible. We should be doing it already.
Right.
I mean, we are doing it, but we should be doing it in our family sedans.
Right. Exactly. That whole story, they go to buy the ship, and they're all arguing about which one they're going to get. And this one has like more like stuff that the girls want or whatever. And this one's got a better engine, and it's the boys that are down in the freaking engineering bay looking at it. Yeah, I think you're talking about that's called the Rolling Stones.
Yeah, the Rolling Stones
by
Robert
Heinlein.
I was just blown away by that. I'm like, dude, this is so. We should be doing this.
Yeah.
You know. Don't forget your pressure suit there, little Johnny. Blah, blah, whatever. I listened to the audiobook. It was great.
Yep. And one of my favorite quotes in the Rolling Stones is when they're talking about they've gone to Mars, and now they're talking about the possibility of going out to the asteroid belt. And the father says, well, I've been wanting to get a look at the bones of Lucifer.
Ah, that's cool.
So you already have, back then, Hyman was a snake bro.
Yeah.
He knew that this was Tiamat, the bones of Lucifer, that the asteroid belt was a destroyed planet.
That's freaking awesome, dude.
Yeah, Heinlein's great. If you want anybody who's interested in the science fiction greats, I recommend anything by Arthur C. Clarke, Larry Niven, Robert Heinlein, Frederick Pohl. So I've named some of these people before on the podcast, but those are just and there's one that I'm forgetting that should be in that list, one of the 4 greats, but I can't remember it right now. Isaac Asimov, thank you, Watcher. Isaac Asimov wrote, talking about AI, he wrote a fantastic entire series about robots and AI. Like a whole series of short stories that each one involves some mystery with AI doing something strange, and these people have to figure out what the hell's going on with their robots, right? And each robot is built for a specific task, usually because in his idea, robots were tools. AI was tools, and he was the one that came up with the 3 laws of robotics. Mm-hmm. All right. most of the movies that you've seen about iRobot and all those kind of things have destroyed his whole idea because he hated the Frankenstein complex. That's what he called it.
They should have called it You Robot because it's all about millennials.
You Robot. All right, and on that note, I think we're done for the week. Thank you guys very much. Thanks to Kyle and Ty for all the music. Thanks to Kyle for all of the production quality is getting better and better all the time, and it is awesome. Thanks to Brett the Watcher for keeping us on the straight and narrow of terms of the truth. And you guys can get a hold of us at brothersoftheserpent@gmail.com, which some of you have been doing. Thank you very much. You guys can go to the website at brothersoftheserpent.com. You can comment there on any of the shows, read Brenner's alternative descriptions of the shows. Oh, yeah, and thanks to Brenner for the Sands of Time and the monitor that we're not using. But still, thanks for all those things. And that's it.
Yeah. Keep listening to that cosmic funk.
Good night, Adamu. Get funky.